For those of you who are wondering where I'm from, my name is Irish, but I have lived in New Zealand for nearly 20 years now. I have 2 Kiwi children, so feel very fortunate to really have 2 amazing homes, Ireland and New Zealand. What I've been asked to talk about today is about New Zealand adults' dietary habits. Now, Chloe's already told you quite a bit about that, and I apologise for the fact that there might be a little bit of overlap, but I'll speed through anything that Chloe's already covered off in detail. But hopefully by the end of it, it gives you a feel and a taste for where we're sitting in New Zealand in terms of our current diets, why the information that you're collecting is important and how it might be used. And actually, you know, I should say before I actually talk in any detail that as a population nutrition researcher and somebody who works in the area of public health, it's really exciting to see that we're actually starting to collect some dietary information again. Chloe mentioned that our last children's nutrition survey was in 2002 and our last adult nutrition survey was a decade ago. So we've really been lacking up-to-date nutrition information. So it's great that we're going to have some dietary habit information that we'll be able to get an understanding for what's been happening to New Zealanders and their diets over the past 10 years. At the beginning of the presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about diet and burden of disease and really explain why this information is important and why a good healthy diet is important for New Zealand and how unhealthy diets are impacting on our overall health. I will talk briefly about the guidelines, but not in too much detail because Chloe's talked a bit about them, and how they inform the questions that are in the dietary habits module, and then just finish talking, as Carol said, about how this kind of information might be used here. So in terms of burden of disease in New Zealand, the Ministry of Health has done a very detailed analysis to work out what are the major risks, the major preventable risks to health for New Zealanders. And what this graph is showing very clearly is that unhealthy diet is now the #1 ranked preventable risk for ill health in New Zealand. And then the second ranked risk factor is high BMI or overweight and obesity. Together, those 2 risk factors account for about 1/5 of overall poor health in New Zealand. And you can see that they're both outranking tobacco and smoking now. So as smoking has come down in New Zealand, unhealthy diets and obesity have unfortunately continued to increase and have now overtaken smoking as the leading preventable risks to health in New Zealand. And what the graph is showing, does this work? Yeah, is the colours show how, what diseases are attributable to these risk factors. So the dark blue here is cancer, the light blue is heart disease, the green is diabetes, and this is kidney disease. So you can see that diet and being overweight or obese are major risks in terms of increasing risk of cancer, heart disease and diabetes, which are big problems here in New Zealand. So it makes sense that we really need to be understanding what Kiwis are eating, but also what we might be able to do to support all of us to eat more healthily and be more healthy as a result. When we consider burden of disease, though, and we look at a graph like that, what it often hides is that there are big inequalities in New Zealand in terms of burden of disease. And diet-related burden of disease is no different to other risks. So what we can see here is that our Māori and Pacifica populations are bearing the greatest burden of diet-related disease in New Zealand, with higher prevalence of obesity, higher prevalence of diabetes, and other associated diet-related diseases. And that's why it's so important in the health survey to have good representation of Māori, Pacifica and other populations so that we can really understand what's going on across our whole population. So we know that poor diet is a major cause of poor health. But we do have guidelines in New Zealand in terms of what a healthy diet is and what all of us should be striving for or aiming to do if we are to eat more healthily. And what this slide is showing here, this is an extract from the New Zealand guidelines, the eating and activity guidelines for New Zealand adults. And this is really breaking it down into what are called the 4 major food groups. So there's fruit and vegetables, there's grain foods, there's dairy, and then there's the protein food group. And the guidelines are telling us that we should be eating plenty of fruit and vegetables. If we're eating grain foods, that we should be choosing whole grains or those particular types of grains that are high in fibre. In terms of dairy, that we should be choosing lower fat options. And the protein foods can either be vegetable protein, like legumes, nuts and seeds, for example, or they can be meat sources of protein as well. The guidelines do go into detail as well in terms of providing recommendations in terms of numbers of serve sizes per day as well. In addition to thinking about the 4 major food groups, what the guidelines also do is take account of what we know in terms of New Zealand diets and what kind of changes should be made to support healthier diets. So here the recommendations are saying that we should be choosing unsaturated fats rather than saturated fats, that we should be choosing foods that are low in salt and added sugar. And also that in general what we should be striving for is a diet that has more whole unprocessed foods in it and less processed foods. And you know, the advantage of that is that we automatically cut down on our salt, sugar and saturated fat intakes if we choose more whole unprocessed foods. And that water should be our first choice of beverages. Chloe already showed this slide, so I'm not going to focus on that, but this is really just another way of illustrating what I've been talking about in terms of what are the healthy swaps that we should be making if we're going to have a healthy diet. So the guidelines are there, pretty simple, clear information about what we should all be doing. You kind of think, why aren't we all doing that in that case? But the fact is that eating behaviour is incredibly complex and it gets oversimplified, I think, a lot of the time, because in the media what we often hear is it's down to individual responsibility, or it should be the government's responsibility, it's the fault of the food industry. You know, it gets kind of quite dichotomized in terms of isn't it just simple that, you know, we all know what we should be doing it. What this picture is showing is it's called the socio-ecological model of health, and it shows how all of our health-related behaviours are influenced by multiple settings and multiple domains. So a lot of the focus tends to go on these interpersonal factors. So our knowledge, our preference, our skills, you know, do we know how to cook? Are we actually motivated to make behaviour change? And this is where a lot of the media and debate and focus often goes. But what the model is showing us is that all of these factors and decisions that we make are influenced by much wider, broader settings and domains. So, for example, policies policies that influence the labelling of food, the pricing of food, the availability of food. So what kinds of foods are available in our schools and in our supermarkets and in our workplaces. Those kind of policies have a bearing on what we as individuals can eat and choose to eat. And likewise, you know, as I said, there are settings here, but not just school settings, but also workplaces, supermarkets and so on, and then interpersonal factors in terms of the influences that you know, other people and our peers have as well on what we eat. So I just want you, I guess, to bear that in mind, that diet it's not a simple behaviour, and the influences on what we eat are not simple either. You know, when we talk about improving diets, we really need to be thinking about improving all of these factors and not just focusing on knowledge and skills and so on, which is where often a lot of the focus and the debate goes, but we should be thinking about how can we create healthier environments that support all of us as individuals to make healthier food choices. So not surprisingly, I guess, in that context, because we live increasingly in what's often termed an obesogenic environment, so an environment that actually supports overweight and obesity rather than healthy eating. So not surprisingly in that context, not all New Zealanders are following or able to follow the New Zealand dietary guidelines. So previous health surveys and our national nutrition surveys tell us a little bit about what we know in terms of how well New Zealanders are achieving dietary guidelines. So for example, the guideline around fruit and vegetable consumption is that we should be consuming 3 servings of vegetables a day and 2 servings of fruit. What we know from the amazing work that all of you have been doing is that New Zealanders struggle to meet that guideline, and only about 2/3 of us are consuming enough vegetables, and just over half are consuming enough fruit. So despite the fact that there's clear guidelines and we know what we need to be doing, what the health survey data is telling us is that we're not managing to achieve that. And also what's important to note is, if we go back to what I mentioned at the beginning about there being inequalities across our population, we see some very clear inequalities in New Zealand in terms of our populations and the proportions who are achieving different dietary guidelines. So this again is where the health survey information is really important. Chloe mentioned the grains as well, and so the dietary guideline is to eat more whole grain foods when we're choosing grains. But what we know from nutrition survey data is that it's only a minority of adults that are choosing, you know, what are called the heavy grains, or those that have the most whole grain in them. And if we think about something like bread, which is a major source of fibre and whole grain in the New Zealand diet, we see that a significant proportion of our population are choosing white bread or light grain breads as their first choice. So again, here's an example of where we know the guideline is giving us some guidance, but we know that New Zealanders aren't following the guidance for whatever reason that may be. Continuing on with this, our guidance is around choosing low-fat dairy products, but only about half of our population are consuming low-fat or trim milk when buying or consuming milk. So again, there's an example of where we know that improvements can still be made. Salt is actually it's not talked about a lot in New Zealand, but it's actually a major risk factor for poor health. Salt is very strongly associated with blood pressure levels. So we know from a lot of international evidence that the more salt people consume, the higher their blood pressure tends to be. What the National Nutrition Survey was able to tell us is where New Zealanders are getting most of their salt from. So again, in contrast to what might often be assumed, it's not the salt that we add at the table or in cooking that is the major source of the salt that we consume in our diet, but actually it's processed foods, which again is the reason why the guidance is telling us that it's better for us to consume whole, unprocessed foods. But if we look at what type of processed foods, the major source of salt in New Zealand diet is bread. And then what this information is telling us is that there are a number of other sources that are also important, but somewhat less important than bread. So that's where the nutrition survey has been able to give us some really important information, because if we relate that to what that means for New Zealanders, it's not so much about the salt that we as individuals add, but actually what this information tells us is that we need to be looking at what the food industry is doing and putting into food. So bread is a staple food in New Zealand. Almost everybody consumes it. So perhaps this is indicating that there needs to be some work with industry to be reducing the salt levels in bread. This is looking at added sugars. So unless you've been living under a rock, you're probably aware that sugar is the hot topic in terms of diet. And if you're out there talking to people about diet, I can guarantee that you'll get caught up in conversations about sugar because it's what everybody is focusing on at the moment. It's important to remember that the area of concern with sugar is added sugar. So it's the sugar that's added to food during processing and manufacturing, or that we add ourselves to food, but not the natural sugars that are present in fruit and vegetables and dairy products. They don't have the adverse effects on our metabolism and health that the added sugar does. So again, where dietary data is useful and important is that it's able to tell us what major sources of added sugar are, and again gives us some direction in terms of what do we in New Zealand need to be doing if we're going to support our society and our population to reduce sugar intakes. And for example, we know that the largest single source of added sugar in all New Zealanders' diets, but particularly our young New Zealanders, is sugary drinks. And hence the reason why a lot of the debate and a lot of the interest is around consumption of sugary drinks. Chloe mentioned, and I did at the beginning as well, that our dietary data for both adults and children is very old now. But the last comprehensive National Nutrition Survey for adults was done in 2008, 2009. So 10 years ago now, and so a lot of the data that I've just presented actually dates from 10 years ago. And if you think about, the kinds of foods that you're eating now, you've probably, you'll know that our diets are changing all the time. So it's really important that we have more up-to-date information on what New Zealanders are eating. The comprehensive or full nutrition survey contains a lot of other modules and information in addition to the dietary habits. So Chloe's already described a 24-hour dietary recall. This is an example of the kind of information that's collected in that. It's very detailed information on what a person has consumed over the previous 24 hours. If you try and cast your mind back to what you've eaten over the last 24 hours, it'll give you some idea over the fact that it's quite hard for people to remember, and so it requires a lot of interviewer time to really prompt and get good, accurate information. But it gives us really detailed, comprehensive information on diets. And in addition to the 24-hour recall and the dietary habits module, there was a lot of other information collected in those surveys, like supplement use, diet-related health, and also, as well as height, weight and blood pressure, which I know are collected in the health survey, blood samples were taken as well, which were used to measure actual levels of particular nutrients of concern. So things that we know are areas of concern for New Zealand, so iodine levels, vitamin D, folic acid, and so on. So there's quite a lot of extra information that goes with those full nutrition surveys, but absolutely fantastic that we're at least getting some up-to-date information on dietary habits through this module. I'm not going to dwell on this because Chloe's already talked about it, but really what I was talking about previously was to really, help illustrate why the dietary habit questions that are in the module are in there. They relate to the dietary guidelines, but they also relate to the areas that we know are particular areas of concern for New Zealand diets. So they're really just trying to kind of gauge how New Zealanders are doing in relation to those particular areas of concern. So this is my final slide, and I think I mentioned that nutrition researchers, public health, government agencies, all kinds of people out there are really excited about the information that you're going to be collecting, because it's the first new information that we're going to be getting for a long time. What might happen with that information? I mean, obviously it can be used to inform our dietary guidelines, so it gives us an understanding of whether New Zealanders are meeting the current guidelines, whether the guidelines need to be adapted or updated in any way. But they also give us a steer in terms of nutrition policies. Down here, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but there's a list of a whole heap of potential policies, and they include things, like I say, around the labelling of food and how well we help people understand whether a food is healthy or unhealthy. So some of you may have seen the new Health Star rating system that's starting to appear on packaged foods in supermarkets. That's a policy that's in place to support New Zealanders to make healthier food choices. Other policies might be around guidance around what kind of foods are available in schools for New Zealand children. Some countries have policies in place, not New Zealand, but other countries, around food taxes or taxing sugary drinks. There are policies around working with industry to reformulate foods. So I mentioned the fact that processed foods are our major source of salt in New Zealand. So there are other countries that use dietary information to set targets for industry, for example, around what level of salt should there be in New Zealand bread? Should there be a maximum target of 450 milligrams per 100 grams, because we know it's the major source of salt, and if industry adhere to that, that's going to be a really easy way for all of us to reduce our salt intakes. So that's an example of how this kind of information can influence policies, and while New Zealand has some policies in place and some not in place, it does help us to kind of think about the future and what kind of policies might be supportive and help. A lot of the dietary habit survey is the same as the previous one that was done 10 years ago. So a first really obvious piece of work will be to actually see how things have changed over the last 10 years and where are the areas of improvement and where are the areas of concern. And I think an important, exciting area that was mentioned earlier today as well is the potential to integrate the dietary, all health survey data, but in this case I'm thinking about dietary data, into the integrated data infrastructure. So that's the database that contains lots of information, not just about other health outcomes like hospitalizations and prescriptions and so on, but also lots of other things like educational achievement, income, productivity. So for those of us who work in the area of nutrition and diet, it's an exciting opportunity to actually look a little bit more closely and see how our dietary habits might be linked to lots of other important outcomes, not just health outcomes, but productivity and well-being more generally as well.